The Great Migration. This may be familiar to some of you. Hopefully it is. The Great Migration was the mass movement of African Americans from the South to urban centers in the North. As many as 6 million people participated in this migration. Now, this is happening in the kind of early 20th century. So if we're thinking about why would 6 million people be moving in these kind of huge numbers, leaving the South and going to the North? And there's a few reasons. So one is racial violence. This is what we were focusing a lot last week. They're escaping the lynchings, the fear of lynchings, even if none of their immediate family or immediate community has been targeted, there's always that fear that it could happen. So they're really fleeing that racial violence. They're fleeing the lack of jobs and lack of good paying jobs, the lack of education, of good schools, the Jim Crow segregation that exists in the South, and they're also being drawn by the industrialization of the North. In the early 20th century, the factories of the North were really booming, and Northern business owners felt that they could pull in these black workers. They could pay them less than they were paying their white workers. They could also use them to try to break strikes of white workers. And so there were job opportunities, and a much greater degree of safety, and less, at least, overt and explicit racism in the North. So these are all factors that are pulling Southern blacks to leave their homes. Sometimes it's just individuals, sometimes it's families, sometimes it's entire communities that pick up and leave and go to the North. Here we can see the decades that this is happening. You can see the 1940s and 50s. You have some of the highest numbers, but that even in the 1910s and 20s, you have high numbers of African Americans going to the North. Now in the 30s, we see that dip. That's because of the Great Depression. There weren't jobs in the North because there weren't jobs really anywhere. And especially not for African Americans. This graph shows us some other numbers, looking at the percentage of African Americans who are living in the South. And you can see that it's pretty steady, just a little over 90%. And it doesn't start to dip under 90% until 1910. And that we have this pretty steady decline in up to 1970 when it starts to kind of even out again. So again, this is showing numbers of African Americans leaving the South. This is another image. One of the problems with this map, though, is it is ignoring California. And this is how we end up with large populations of African Americans in cities like Oakland, out in California. But many were going to Chicago, Detroit, New York City, to these big kind of industrialized urban centers. And we can see some of the population numbers. Chicago going from 44.1 African Americans, that's 1,044,000 African Americans in 1910 to 109,000 African Americans by 1920. That's 10 years. Right? These differences are over just 10 years. So you can see really significant increases in a lot of these cities. Some of them were packing up cars and heading out to, whatever their destination was they had in mind. Whatever city they heard was maybe the best, or they already had friends or family there. Sometimes they were traveling on the railroads, and they were getting on the trains. And often they would encounter this kind of strange thing that would happen once they got into the northern states and out of the Jim Crow South, is that all of a sudden, the train cars weren't segregated anymore. And that being something that many of them had never experienced. So there's these different modes of kind of travel of getting to northern cities. Now the North's reaction is interesting too, because there's this kind of assumption that things are better in the North. And things were better, but that doesn't mean that there was no racism. And Northerners start to develop more racist practices, policies, regulations, and ideas, and more racial violence as the population of African Americans grows in the North. If you only have a small percentage of your population, that's 1, 2, 3, even 10 or less percent of your population is African American, then the population as a whole isn't really taking note of that. Once you have these really dramatic increases in numbers of African Americans, then they're being noticed. Then they might be blamed for lack of jobs, for competition in terms of work, in terms of housing, those kinds of things. So that racial violence African Americans were trying to escape ends up developing in the North as well. We have a number of race riots, one of them in 1917 in East St. Louis. Somewhere between 40 and 200 blacks were killed, and 600 or 6,000 fled the city because of the violence from that riot in 1917. In 1919 was what was called the Red Summer. There were 26 race riots across the country. Now, this wasn't only in the North, but it was happening in northern cities. The biggest race riot of that summer was in Chicago. 15 white people and 23 blacks were killed. About 1,000 black people lost their homes due to arson. Then there's the 1943 Detroit race riot. 25 blacks and 9 whites were killed. About 700 people were injured. The fighting lasted for 3 days, and it only ended when 6,000 U.S. Army troops were brought in. Entire black neighborhoods were destroyed in that riot. So this is some of the violence, right? Again, the African Americans were trying to escape by leaving the South, and it just kind of follows them into the North. Here we have a sign up saying we want white tenants in our white community. I had you guys read in our last week that article that was about reparations, but a big thing that they focused on that article was the housing in Chicago and the really racist housing policies that were in effect. So African Americans are going to the North in hopes of, it's this dream, that they will have better freedom and safety and security. And for some of them, it turns into more of a nightmare instead. And it might be better in some ways, but in other ways, it is still dangerous and violent, and they're still facing discrimination and low wages and being cheated out of those wages that they get in terms of housing policies and what homes they're able to buy. But we see a lot of changes because of this great migration. And we'll be talking about one of them in my next little PowerPoint.